Bluegrass Jamalong is proud to be sponsored by Collins Guitars and Mandolins, each and every one built from the sound up in Austin, Texas.
You know, I happened to come of age in the 60s when music was blowing up. Again, the Beatles and Van Dyke Parks and everybody. And I was primed for that. And Jefferson Airplane, blah, blah, blah. And I got to see Hendrix and Janis Joplin. And people look back, like my dog always went, God, I wish I'd lived then. And as you say, I moved to New York City when you could afford to live in New York City. And there weren't that many record companies out there, but Rounder Records, okay, we'll put out your crazy banjo album. And then all these festivals were there to play at. We just, like as I said, first year we were together, we did 10 festivals, and suddenly we were getting our name out there. So yeah, it was a much easier time.
Hi, this is Matt, and you're listening to Bluegrass Jamalong, the podcast for anyone and everyone who loves bluegrass. Hey everybody, welcome back to Bluegrass Jamalong. My guest this week is Tony Trischka, who regular listeners will know has been on the podcast a couple of times before. Always a treat chatting to Tony. This one came about because after chatting to David Grisman and Mike and Todd and Daryl last year about the Grisman Quintet, just talking about that bit of string band music in the mid-70s and the instrumental stuff, a lot of what came out was just chatting about what was going on in New York at that time as well, and a little bit before then. And Tony was very, very involved in that. Bands like Breakfast Special and Country Cooking, but also his own early solo records. So I thought, let's have a chat about that. It's a really interesting time. I think one of the key threads that came out of that Grisman chat was that there were sort of three sort of main centres of instrumental string band music around then, and one of them was the Bay Area in the mid-70s, and then sort of Nashville in the 80s and 90s, but also New York in the 70s. And so I wanted to chat to Tony about kind of how the folk revival influenced that, how the players that came up playing in New York and in the North in general maybe didn't come out of a family string band tradition in the same way, but had come to music through the folk revival and other things, and kind of how that affected the music, how that all came together. Fascinating stuff about how that overlapped with the early days of Rounder Records, how the kind of the scenes joined when Tony started making records with people like Tony Rice and Mike Marshall and David Grisman, and just so much fascinating stuff in there. I always love chatting to Tony. It is really interesting. At the end of the interview, he mentions a book, and that's sort of partly also why I wanted to talk to him. I'm starting to put together a plan for a book, and it's early days. So I'll tell you more about that in future. But some of the interviews on the podcast will definitely touch on stuff that will be relevant to that. I'm certainly not going to steer the podcast just towards research for that project. It's going to still be what it is, chat about all sorts of bluegrass things, string band things, related things, adjacent things. But this one sort of sits nicely in the middle of both. So I'll tell you a bit more about that one a bit further down the line. It's very early days yet. But yes, that's why he mentions writing a book at the end. That is it. I'm going to let you have a listen to Tony Trischka. If you missed the episodes about the Grisman Quintet, I'll stick links in the show notes because that's all very related to this. And you might enjoy those. But yeah, all the usual stuff applies. If you want more info, go to bluegrassjamalong.com. You can support the podcast via the link in the show notes, or you can subscribe on Apple Podcasts, or you can just share an episode with a friend who you think might enjoy it. That's it. Here comes Tony Trischka. Hope you enjoy this one. Tony Trischka, welcome back to Bluegrass Jamalong. Great to see you, as it always is.
The same, Matt. Always wonderful to be with you. Yeah,
I've been really looking forward to this conversation. To give the listeners a bit of context, I think most people who listen to this podcast know that I'm a huge fan of kind of instrumental string band music, particularly original kind of experimental, progressive, whatever you want to call it. And I talked quite a lot last year on the podcast with David Grisman and with Mike Marshall and Daryl Anger about the early days of the Grisman Quintet as being a big part of that. And we talked about the subsequent stuff with Bela and Jerry and people like that in Nashville. But we also talked quite a bit about how formative the scene in and around New York in the early 70s was, and particularly some of the stuff you were involved with. And I thought it'd be a great opportunity to have a chat about that because it's such a fascinating bit of the history of this music.
Yeah, we were sort of in a different world than the Nashville scene or the California scene. Those were the three hotbeds. of this music. And, David Grisman was in New York. He was from New Jersey originally and was part of the New York scene in the 60s when I was still in diapers. Okay, maybe not diapers, but was much younger. And he had a record company called Silver Bell, something like, I may have that wrong, but something like that. And he took out an ad in Sing Out magazine for a single he was putting out by the New York Ramblers. I hope I'm not going too far back here, but it's David as part of the New York scene. And it was him on this album, or on the single, with Jody Stecker and on guitar, I think it was, and Winnie Winston on banjo and Gene Lowinger on fiddle. I'm forgetting the name of the bass player right now. Fred Weiss, I want to say. And they did the New York Ramble, which became Doggy Mountain Breakdown later on, and The Old House. Those were the two songs on the single. And shortly thereafter, and I ordered it, and shortly thereafter I went to see Red Allen, the bluegrass singer and guitar player from Ohio. Went to see him playing in Pennsylvania. And this would have been 66, maybe, 1966, thereabout, 67. And I show up at the show, and David is playing with Red Allen. And I introduced myself, and I was like in high school at this point. I said, "Hi, I'm Tony Trischka." He said, "Oh, you're one of the 9 people that ordered that single," because he remembered I had this weird name. So, and then he put out a second single with Frank Wakefield and Chubby Weiss on fiddle. And that was it. So, but there was this New York scene percolating in the kind of mid to slightly later 60s with that band, the New York Ramblers. And they also were at the very first Bluegrass Festival, 3-day festival in Fincastle, Virginia in 1965, Labor Day weekend. And they performed there as that band. Go ahead.
I was going to say, just it's really interesting kind of, I've talked to you and you've talked in other interviews about your kind of route into the banjo through the folk revival in New York, and the New York area was a huge part of the folk revival. But there's a really interesting thing that goes on through the 60s into the 70s, like observing it from all this time away and as a fan. But it feels like there's this emergence of a bunch of people who are playing bluegrass and related music, but grew up in a city, like didn't necessarily learn to play the songs with their family, kind of that, and this confluence of the folk revival and the Beatles and the British invasion.
Exactly.
That kind of just pulled everybody into this thing that was really grounded in a love of folk music and traditional music, but also wanted to be current and progressive.
Right. Yeah, that's exactly what happened to me, speaking for myself, and I'm sure others as well. Again, I started playing the banjo in 1963, coming out of the folk revival, and then learning about bluegrass and going to these bluegrass festivals. And then the Beatles started getting weird and, doing Revolver and Sgt. Pepper and Magical Mystery Tour and on and on and on. And that had a huge influence on me because every new Beatles single you hear on the radio was stretching the boundaries, pushing a little bit farther. Strawberry Fields Forever or Tomorrow Never Knows, any of these songs that were really pushing the envelope of what could be done in popular music. And then there was Zappa, and there was Brian Wilson with the Beach Boys doing his more experimental things, and on and on. And then I started listening to jazz in the early 70s and hearing, Coltrane and Charlie Parker, et cetera, but then also getting caught up in the whole, the whole thing with Chick Corea, Mahavishnu, the whole fusion thing, the Weather Report, those kinds of things. And so, but even very early on, I had a bad banjo gene because I entered this banjo contest in 1965 at that first Bluegrass Festival. And the judges were Ralph Stanley. I might have mentioned this to you before. And Lamar Greer, who was playing with Bill Monroe, and Bill Emerson. And I played 9-pound hammer with fake Middle Eastern modes. And I lost badly, needless to say. So I'd only been playing for a couple of years, and I was already doing weird stuff. Because I grew up, in the North, and my parents listened to Broadway shows and Stravinsky, and just so I didn't have the influences that someone like Earl Scruggs had. So even early on, I had that sort of thing going on, but I was definitely pushed further into that scene, because of everything that was going on in the mid to later 60s and into the early 70s. It's like, well, let's just make music on this instrument. It doesn't have to be bluegrass.
Well, and it's interesting because when I talked to Mike and Daryl about the Grisman stuff, they were definitely, like, the way they saw it was that because New York is such a melting pot of cultures and influences anyway as a place, it was only natural that would be reflected in the kind of music coming out of it.
Right.
You know, you've got that. No, it's not just the kind of Scots-Irish fiddle tradition that comes through in a lot of US folk music. You've also got other European music coming through and kind of elements of klezmer or gypsy jazz or all sorts of other things.
Right. Yeah, well, I was living in Syracuse, and in 1972, I think, we did a country cooking album with Kenny Kosek and Andy Statman. Kenny Kosek, the fiddler, and Andy Statman, the amazing mandolin player who's still performing. And we recorded in Ithaca, New York, and they came up from New York City on a bus, and on the bus ride back home after the session, they decided, let's put a band together with me and some other folks, and that became this band Breakfast Special. And we started in 1973, and I moved down to the Bronx, half a block from Yankee Stadium, which was culture shock after growing up in Syracuse. And it was Kenny and Andy and me and a guy named Stacy Phillips on dobro, who also was experimenting quite a bit with the dobro. A guy named Jim Tolles on guitar and Roger Mason on bass. And we had a drummer named Richard Crooks. And, we were coming out of bluegrass, most of us, but we would also do, it wasn't klezmer, but Jewish music. Jewish music, we do Hawaiian music, including Princess Papuli's Got Plenty Papaya. I won't go into the rest of it. Many double entendres. She loves to give it away. And I just said more than I wanted to say. Anyway, and then we would do a Sam Cooke tune, an a cappella gospel Sam Cooke tune that he did with the Soul Stirrers, and a Cajun influence with a tune called Sugar Bee. And in addition to fiddle, in addition to the me playing banjo, I also played pedal steel guitar, and Andy played saxophone. He played tenor sax. So at some point in our show, we'd switch into that kind of a sound, and suddenly, with a drummer, and we'd be rocking out. And so when we play these bluegrass festivals, and the first year we started, and everything was sort of moving in this more progressive direction. I mean, not everything, but there was that element, because we made 2 phone calls, one to Jim Clark, who booked a lot of festivals and didn't always pay people, but who cares about that? And then Carlton Haney, who started the first Bluegrass Festival in 1965. We made one call to Carlton and got on 5 festivals with just him. I remember playing this festival in North Carolina with Breakfast Special. I'm sitting at the pedal steel, and we would do the afternoon shows. We do more bluegrassy kind of things. In the evenings, we do the rocked out stuff. And so the motorcycle gangs loved us because they wanted to hear rock and roll. And I remember playing steel, and this guy from the Pagans, this motorcycle gang, is sitting next to me with full colors on the edge of the stage, sharpening a really long knife. And I'm going, oh, hello there. I hope you're enjoying our music. And it was that kind of a scene. And people were dying at these festivals, drug overdoses. It was a crazy time. And there was some violence and et cetera, et cetera. It wasn't all like that, but there was that element, not like things are today. So, but things, the Earl Scruggs Review was out there doing more progressive things because Earl didn't want to be playing just straight ahead bluegrass anymore. He wanted to play with the Sons and be doing more progressive things. The David Bromberg, and Earl was on Columbia, and David Bromberg was on Columbia with his big band, doing bluegrass and rock and other things like that. There was a group called the Goose Creek Symphony that also was coming out of bluegrass to some extent and doing more progressive things. So there was this scene of people doing that kind of a thing. And, we were definitely, I remember this one time on Sunday at noon, I think the gospel portion of the morning had just finished, and Buck White and the Down Home folks and the Whites had just done a beautiful gospel set. And we were getting set up for our set. And Andy Statman had klezmer music from the 30s on his little cassette machine. And while we're getting set up, he put it into the microphone, and there's this crazy Jewish clarinet music going out through the sound system. These people in the lawn chairs are going, "What? What is that?" So
We'll be right back with you just after this. The long-awaited Hill Country series from Collings Guitars represents a new voice in their acoustic lineup. Rooted deep in the bluegrass world, these new Dreadnought NOM models feature a strong fundamental tone with a dry, warm and woody character that's sure to catch the attention of players who hold the vintage instruments of the 30s in their highest regard. Watch world-class pickers Jake Workman, Kenny Smith and Bob Minner perform with new Hill Country instruments on the Collings Guitars YouTube channel, and learn more at collingsguitars.com. And it sounds from the stuff that I've read that the sort of stage set in general was kind of a lot more kind of comedy about it. It wasn't just that the music was kind of eclectic. There was a kind of performance element of it as well.
It was with our band?
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Some things that were probably should never have been said on stage. I listened to a set a couple of years ago that we had done, and certainly a third of what was going on was just talking, these strange, weird New York senses of humor. I was sort of the straight guy when I moved down to New York, and these guys had this really crazy New York energy and crazy sense of humor. And I remember we played this college gig in New Jersey one time, and our fiddle player broke a string or something, and our bass player just held forth for about 5 minutes telling you how to change a leaky faucet. You know what? Okay, well, yes. And I could give you other stage raps, which are too risque to mention on stage. But anyway, so yeah, we were pretty crazy. It wasn't. I think it was probably the audience was probably going, huh? It wasn't like comedy for the audience; it was for ourselves more than anything else, and that's why we never recorded till after we broke up. Rounder Records recorded us after we broke up, which seemed like a good business model, but maybe not.
I mean, just from some of the stuff I've read about the early days of Rounder, they're not business-led decisions always, are they? It's a very interesting approach. The early days of all of this, just sort of looking through the kind of discography of things you played on around that time, and pretty much all of it came out on Rounder in the early days of, like, particularly the country cooking stuff. That was getting going at the same sort of time as Rounder, really, wasn't it?
Right, yeah. Rounder started like maybe 1970 in our first album. We were something like the 7th album that they put out. It was the first country cooking album. But the fact that they would put out my instrumental banjo albums was really a bad business decision, because most of the folks on the first 2 albums were from Breakfast Special. And a lot of my own tunes, just doing some pretty crazy things. And again, with saxophone and just odd things that I'd written that, anything I would do in many ways would be coming out of Earl Scruggs, but, tempered with these other, things I was hearing, not always 3 chords. And again, being influenced by the Beatles and all these other folks that I'm talking about. So it would just put a spin on everything. And everyone else in the band, like Stacy Phillips or Andy or Kenny, we were all thinking in the same way. We're all barking up the same tree.
And it's really interesting listening to the country cooking stuff, because it's, like, in many ways a bit straighter than some of the Breakfast Special stuff, but all those elements that kind of go through that thread of instrumental sort of progressive string band music is that there's original tunes, there's some great playing, there's some, the level of arrangement starts to get a bit more complicated further down the line, rather than just here's a tune and some breaks. But, so even just listening to like Russ play guitar on some of those tunes, like Russ Barenberg, like Silver Bell, his break on that is just, it's everything that you love about Russ Barenberg. It's taking the tune and just playing it a little bit differently. And it's there from so early on. It was amazing hearing that.
Yeah, and he had just beautiful tone and beautiful ideas. And again, none of us were totally coming out of straight ahead bluegrass. We all had these other influences. And there was the New York scene, but I started with country cooking. That's how it all came to pass. And I got introduced to Pete Warnick, who started country cooking, through David Bromberg, who came to Syracuse with his bass player. And it was David Bromberg and the Fabulous Torpedoes, and the Fabulous Torpedoes with Steve Berg, his bass player. That was the Fabulous Torpedoes was his bass player. And Pete Wernick came up to Syracuse because that's where Barenberg was playing, came up to Syracuse from Ithaca because he knew David from New York. And then I was introduced to Peter that night, and we did a double banjo thing with David that night, and that started the whole thing. And then since Rounder Records started in Ithaca, which is where Pete was, he was friendly with the Rounders, Ken Irwin and Marion Layton and Bill Nowlin. And, hey, we got this band Country Cooking. Can we do an album? They said, sure. And the first album was a little more straight ahead, but then the second album, and Kenny Kosek was on the first album, but the second one we added Andy with his crazy, wonderful mandolin playing. And I did a tune on there called Kentucky Bullfight, which I had just written and was a little bit odd and a little bit different in the kind of crazy banjo tuning, et cetera, et cetera. So anyway.
It's really interesting, kind of that procession of records on Rounder, both under Country Cooking, under your own name, Breakfast Special, kind of moving forward into some records like Robot Plane Flies Over Arkansas and Hill Country that are moving, I guess, in some ways more towards the kind of records that then came out of Nashville. The scenes sort of felt like they came together a little bit. And obviously on your records, you've got Daryl and Mike and Todd Phillips and people playing on some of those tunes anyway.
Right. It's funny you should say that because I was up in Boston. A friend of ours passed away, a wonderful banjo player, and I was up for the memorial service. And on the way home, in fact, being up there, I saw the Rounders and all the people who were on the scene in the early 70s, but that's another story. But on the way home, I don't ever listen to my own stuff, but I just felt like listening to Robot Plane on the way home. And I was like, wow, it's better than I remembered it. And a lot of that's because there was Mike and Daryl were on there, and Tony Rice was on there. And rather than being in the New York scene, I was playing with the California scene, which was just this whole other attitude. Because with the New York scene, we were just sort of hell-bent for leather and just trying things, I guess you could say. And, our timing wasn't terrible, but it wasn't always like really locked in like the Nashville guys or the California guys. And, they would play more perfectly, I guess you could say. And we were just kind of going for it. But then I found that my own playing started getting a little more technically together, I think, as time went on. Partly because I was playing with, not completely, but partly because I was, having these sessions with the California guys and whatnot. And then I did this album, Banjoland, one side of which had Tony on it and Jerry Douglas and Buck White and Bill Keith was on there. And Grisman was on there also. I was recording the day after David Grisman finished recording his Rounder album, and Ken Irwin from Rounder Records said, why don't you go to Nashville? These guys are all there, and recorded at least one side of an album, which will be just straight-ahead traditional tunes, so no one has to learn the tunes, and that's what I did. Mm-hmm. And so that was maybe somewhat of I can't say only because of that one recording session in one day, but I think maybe that was sort of a turning point in my playing to some extent. And also Hill Country was the same sort of thing. Most of it was recorded in Nashville. With Sam Bush, talk about time, great time, Sam Bush with his amazing chop, and Tony Rice and folks like that. So Mark O'Connor was on that.
Well, yeah, and it's really interesting, isn't it? Because, a lot of the time we remember the huge contributions Sam Bush has made to vocal music, and Newgrass Revival were very progressive at a similar time in a slightly different field. But you think about some of the stuff that he's, some of the like Strength in Numbers and stuff that feel like pivotal records in the progressive instrumental string band tradition. And he's, I always love hearing him do instrumental stuff as well.
Oh, yeah.
But then you sort of get this moment, don't you, that there's the Rounder New Acoustic Sampler record comes out. And there's this sort of sense I get that people are trying to pull these things together, the different progressive instrumental threads to kind of create a thing around it. And I don't know, it's funny because New Acoustic is then a label that stuck a little bit. And I don't know whether you identify with that as a term, or whether that was a useful umbrella for you guys.
I think at the time it was. I can't remember. I remember Daryl coming up with that term, and he remembers me coming up with that term. And I don't, who knows? But I think, it was in the days of Tower Records, and you have to have a bin for a certain subject. And so maybe that's why we did that. And it was, I don't think it lasted that long. I don't think it really stuck as much as Newgrass did. People still talk about Newgrass today to some extent. But it was trying to give it a name that we in New York and the guys in California and in Nashville were all doing. And unfortunately, it's all guys when you think about it. And, there just weren't that many women that were doing that sort of thing, I guess. And of course, now it's, some of the best bands out there, like Sister Sadie, who are a little more traditional, but, there's so many more women in bluegrass these days, which is as it should always have been. But that's getting off on another subject, of course.
Well, but I find that really interesting because there are, like you think about Sierra Hull and Brittany Haas, and there are just some extraordinary players. There's a long list of extraordinary female bluegrass players, but most of them have focused equally on vocal music or more on vocal music.
I think if I was a good singer, I'd probably sing. That's I remember Pete Warnick said that when he was starting Hot Rise. You have to have a good vocalist if you want to be successful, and he found Tim O'Brien. And it sure made a big difference. And I can think of Alison Brown as someone who doesn't sing.
Yes.
A woman who is a wonderful, wonderful, I just saw her, in fact, a few days ago. Wonderful, wonderful banjo player, great banjo player. And she doesn't sing. But yeah, trying to think of who are the women who, there's Kimber Ludiker. I'm not sure how much she sings. I don't think of her so much as a singer as more of an instrumentalist, but she's a great, great fiddler. You're hard pressed to think of who those women would be.
And you do wonder whether it's kind of a historic thing. And you think back to, the kind of days of old time music when the record business was in its very fledgling years. And it feels like, from what has been recorded and collected, that domestic song was the realm of the females, and instrumental playing for people to dance to was the realm of the men. And you look at the songs Cecil Sharp recorded, and they were not, wrote down, they weren't recorded at that point, they were collected.
Right.
Nearly all songs from women.
Are they?
Yeah, and I just wonder whether there's a slight historic role there as well.
Mm-hmm. The songs he collected were from women, you're saying?
Yeah.
A lot of them.
Very few men he collected songs from.
It's very interesting. Yeah, I didn't realize that. Alan Lomax probably had both, I would think. But yeah, it's interesting. But bluegrass, with the exception of Sally Ann Forrester, who played accordion with Bill Monroe in the 40s. Do you know the story about her name?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, that it's actually Wilhelmina or something like that, or Wileen. But, and people called her Billy. And she told this story to Sam Bush one time, and Sam mentioned it to me that, well, we can't have two Bills in the band. So, and then Bessie Lee Malden, who played bass with Bill Monroe and was, romantically involved with him at various times. So, but yeah, the number of women that were in bluegrass. Rose Maddox recorded an instrumental, not an instrumental, but a bluegrass album, I think with Bill Monroe on some cuts and Don Reno. And that was like in maybe the late 50s or early 60s. But yeah, it was a rare thing. And then, of course, Hazel and Alice, but yeah.
There's also something interesting about the role that cities have played in all of this. New York particularly is kind of melting pot of a city, as we talked about a bit. But it feels like cities played a role in bluegrass anyway, like at the point where rural music was coming, people were migrating to big cities for jobs and taking their music with them, and it started to become music that was a little bit more about the concert stage and the recording studio than necessarily the front porch. And so it seems entirely natural. I love this little confluence of stuff around New York because it was such a hotbed of the folk revival.
Right.
But also the folk revival was such a hotbed of keeping bluegrass going through that strange time where maybe it had its first surge. And it pulled it just back into people's attention. I think New York and the folk revival probably was a bit of a lifeline for bluegrass at that point.
Yeah, or the North. I mean, there was the Newport Folk Festivals. I went there in 63 and 64. And in 63, Bill Monroe was there with Bill Keith playing with him. And in 64, the Stanley Brothers were there and the Greenbrier Boys. Yeah, and so folk music definitely carried bluegrass along. When I first started getting into the banjo, probably because of Louise Scruggs, talking about women in bluegrass. She did so much for Flatt and Scruggs to make their career what it was. And they put out Folk Songs of Our Land in the early 60s, and that was the first real bluegrass album that I bought. And they had, I think, Pastures of Plenty, maybe. I can't remember exactly, but, a Woody Guthrie tune, let's say. And some of it wasn't folk music, but they would call it that, just like the Stanley Brothers had. Bluegrass Hootenanny was one of their albums that came out. We got to get on this, jump on this train before it leaves the station. So folk music was doing a lot for bluegrass. And again, the folk revival was part of that. And New York City, there's the Greenbrier Boys, the first urban bluegrass band. And they were really good. Ralph Rensler and John Harold and a guy named Bob Yellen on banjo, who was doing some pretty progressive stuff, like in the mid to slightly later 60s, playing in different tunings and trying progressive things. He was very progressive as a banjo player, and I got to know him a little bit in his later, into the 70s and 80s a little bit. So
you start to get kind of northern musicians playing in the Bluegrass Boys as well. You've got, that starts to creep in as a thing. And I sort of wondered whether there was any tension around that, whether you experienced any sort of tension around this. You've got the generation of people who came up picking with their parents or their uncle or whoever and were from the kind of bluegrass heartlands versus this sort of northern city, probably university educated, slightly different crowd of people.
You mean like going to a bluegrass festival? Would I feel that tension?
Was there any, or just in general sort of reception to the music, or did it feel like anybody cared about that?
Well, I definitely got some pretty withering reviews for my early albums, for sure. Bluegrass Unlimited and County Sales, which there were County Records, but they had a sales department where you could order any bluegrass album out there from them. So yeah, I would get reviews that were, again, not very positive because what is this crap? And going to festivals, the very first festival in '65, I remember, you had us guys from Syracuse. I mean, I was just in high school. I was actually 16 at that point. We drove a long drive down to Roanoke and Fincastle. But there were lawyers there. Ralph Rensler, who was with the Greenbrier Boys, he was there. Grisman was there. There were lawyers and whatever, teachers, and then there were farmers, and we were all there for the love of the music. And I don't remember any tension with that. It seemed like we were all loving this. God, there's Bill Monroe standing right there, and there's Don Reno and Red Smiley and the Stanley Brothers. And there's Jimmy Martin all in one place at one time. It was so exciting. As things went on and hair started getting longer, I can remember some tension at some of the festivals. I had pretty long hair in like 1970, and I can remember there was nothing overt or fistfights breaking out, but there was a little bit of tension. The hippie redneck divide. But of course that's all gone now because a lot of the rednecks started growing long hair and the hippies started cutting their hair. So that's just all balanced out.
Well, there's that really interesting sort of point in the mid-'70s where you've got things like these records that you guys are making. You've got the first Grisman Quintet record, and things are starting to go in a very progressive direction there. And at the same time, you've got J.D. Crowe, The New South, kind of that happens as well, which feels like a bit of a watershed for that was somehow very traditional and very progressive at the same time.
Exactly. Yeah.
Those years in the 70s feel like such a interesting point in the bluegrass journey. Because people had experimented with electric bass and with drums and things, and there'd been a lot of change, and there was sort of feels to me, looking back on it as an outside observer, there was a real desire for progression and a real desire for tradition at the same time.
Yeah, there was always that divide. There were folks that were doing really straight ahead stuff, and then there were other people. There was Emerson and Waldron, Bill Emerson and Cliff Waldron, who came out in around that time doing Proud Mary. Let's take a rock and roll song and let's make it bluegrass. Or Fox on the Run, which was, I think, by Manfred Mann, as I remember it, and which I recorded on my double banjo album with Dudley Cannell. And I went back and listened to the original rock version of it, which had different chords. And so I recorded it with the original, it sounds very straight ahead, but I used the original chords that they had from the rock and roll version. And I spoke to Bill Emerson about that afterwards. And he said, yeah, we couldn't figure out those chords, so we made out our own chords, which were great. And that's the version everybody knows. So Cliff Waldron, Bill Emerson and Waldron, they had that band, and they were also doing the same sort of thing. But then let's not forget the Country Gentlemen that were doing progressive, kind of the same thing coming out of bluegrass, but stretching the boundaries in the 60s. And they were doing that before a lot of the rest of us. There's so-called Bringing Mary Home, or the theme from Exodus. They would do that, just sort of these, that's not bluegrass, but it was Eddie Adcock on banjo and Charlie Waller and John Duffy and Todd Gray, and what a great band.
So funny, isn't it? Kind of this idea of what bluegrass, quote unquote, is, and what that even means, because all the classic early years was so progressive anyway. But there's very few examples of that where you have the classic 5-inch, lots of time Flat and Scruggs didn't have a mandolin, they had the dobro instead, and Bill never used a dobro. It feels like this set in stone thing was only a thing for such a short amount of time before all the various wings and avenues and tangents that came off it. That actual bit is such a tiny thing.
Yeah, it was Flat and Scruggs with Bill Monroe in late 45 with Chubby Weiss, and that became, this is bluegrass. And for good reason. I mean, what better band could there possibly be? And that became the template for all bluegrass to follow. To this day, in a lot of ways, except, there are all the branches and streams coming off of that.
It's interesting you were saying before, just listening back to the Robot Plane album and kind of being surprised listening to it. Do you, and you said you don't really listen to a lot of the records you made in the 70s anymore. Do you have a particular, does that period feel like a particular thing? Because I'm looking back at it with a kind of almost scholarly interest in it in a strange way. Mm-hmm. And then it's only really sometimes posthumously you look back and group things together and tidy things up into neat things that were never neat in the first place. Just how does that sort of feel as a period to you when you look back at it and think back about it?
Well, I think that particular album, just listening to it yesterday, I guess it was, it feels like, for me personally, it was sort of what I was going after in my first few albums. Once that came out, it was sort of like, okay, my timing's feeling good now, and I feel like my writing is more sophisticated. Not sophisticated as pushing the envelope a little bit. I'm not trying to say I'm so sophisticated, but it was more together. It sort of achieved more of what I was looking for, even though I didn't know I was looking for it. Felt like I listened to a couple of things. Well, I would change that, but for the most part, I'm pretty proud of the music that's on there. Especially a song called "Blown Down the Wall," which was at the end of the session. And I just had this chord progression. And I said, hey, can we just try this? And there was no melody. It was just chords. And we did the recording of it. And Daryl took this, one of the most amazing fiddle solos ever on any album, period. And then the next day, I wrote a line to go through the beginning and end, like at the head of the tune. And we went back in the studio with Mike and Daryl, and I had them play the line, which I'm also very proud of. I'm very proud of that tune. I think of all the, it's one of my favorite tunes that I've written. I guess I'll say that.
It is a great album. It's just sort of digging back through some of this stuff and listening to some of this stuff for the first time, as a relatively recent kind of bluegrass lover in this amount of depth. Just that record particularly stands out as just a glorious thing, regardless of time or place in history or whatever. It's just a great listen.
Oh, I'm glad you feel that way. Yeah. Again, I'm pretty happy with the way it turned out listening back to it. And then Hill Country was in the opposite direction because I was going traditional. I wanted to write all the tunes, but have them be more traditional. I can't play any of the melodic style. It has to be, I don't think there's one melodic lick on the whole thing. And again, that was all the Nashville guys. So, and Bela produced that. And I was fortunate to have Sonny Osborne on there also. I've been very fortunate in my life. Very fortunate. I think about the people that I've gotten to know and the people I've gotten to record with, and it's just crazy. It's just crazy. Yeah.
And I wonder, because two of the things that sort of emerged talking to a few people about kind of these scenes in the 70s, and one of them is just this idea that looking back, most people say, we have no idea what we were doing. Like, and they made some wonderful music to us as listeners, and it's like compared to what we know now, it's astonishing how little we knew about what we were doing when we were doing that record. But the other side of it is just how easier it was to be an artist in a major city in the 70s compared to now, and to spend that time working out what you wanted to do and finding yourself, and people were prepared to record records and put them out, and you could live fairly cheaply, and
right.
It was just that time to be an artist sounds like in some ways a golden time.
Yeah, I mean, again, saying how lucky I am, I happened to come of age in the 60s when music was blowing up. Again, the Beatles and Van Dyke Parks and everybody. And I was primed for that, and Jefferson Airplane, blah, blah, blah. And I got to see Hendrix and Janis Joplin, and people look back, like my daughter looks like, God, I wish I'd lived then. And as you say, I moved to New York City when you could afford to live in New York City. And there weren't that many record companies out there, but Rounder Records, okay, we'll put out your crazy banjo album. And then all these festivals were there to play at, and we just, like as I said, first year we were together, we did 10 festivals, and suddenly we were getting our name out there. So yeah, it was a much easier time. You could live on a dime and record an album that would be released nationally. And yeah, and there were record stores. So yeah, it was sort of a prime time to get a career started. My son's a musician, and he's been doing it for a while now, but it's not as easy as it was when I started to get yourself out there.
Well, and just kind of looking at you, going back to the beginning of what we were talking about, you're talking about the 9 people that bought that Grisman single and this sort of emerging, fledgling scene in and around New York. But you look at the names that came out of that, obviously you, but Russ and Kenny Kosek and Andy Statman and Stacy Phillips and Bela and obviously Grisman as well. And they're just, it's a bit like talking about, mid-70s San Francisco, and Daryl and Mike and Tony and Todd and all gone on to be such major threads of this music over the years.
Right.
It's such a kind of extraordinary, like, training ground in a way for some of the musicians we know and love most in this music.
Yeah. Yeah. And David, we just started playing. We weren't thinking commercially or let's get our act together. Let's just, here's some tunes. Let's go and play. Whereas the way David Grisman did it, he put that band together. As I remember, they didn't play for a year. They just rehearsed all the time, and then finally did a gig after they had their thing totally together. And there's a guy here in New Jersey whose name I'm just spacing right now, unfortunately, who did a lot of the arranging on that first album, who helped create that Grisman sound. David wrote the tunes, but this guy had a hand in arranging them and really making them ready for prime time, as it were. But that's how David wanted to do it. Let's get this totally together. And he was smart enough to get Tony Rice in the band. And Tony was just playing bluegrass before that, and suddenly he's playing over these different chords, and it was a good stretch for him as well. Yeah, I'm sorry, John Carlini.
Of course. Yeah. And we're just thinking about sort of progressive string band music and listening through these records of yours that we're talking about. And it's that sense of arrangement is one of the things that distinguishes it from just here's a original fiddle tune, we're all going to take a break. It's that sense of not everybody's playing all the time. There's harmonized sections. And that particularly comes in really clearly on Robot Plane, is just right. Thinking beyond whose turn is it to take a break. There's much more like that chamber element that then gets extended through and through and through till you end up with Hawktail or whatever. But just the idea of interacting more like a string quartet might than a string band might sometimes.
Yeah, one aspect of that was, as I'm thinking about it, hearing Stevie Wonder's Living for the City And there was this third section of it, this instrumental thing, which was really cool. And that really turned my head around. I was like, oh, I could do something like that. Okay, you have an A part and a B part. You could come up with a C part that has a different flavor to it and adds interest. So I started doing that with tunes, thanks to Stevie Wonder's Living from the City. And so that was a big influence on me. I don't always think about that, but that was a big influence on me in terms of composing tunes.
Mm. I also read somewhere that Aaron Copland was a big influence on
huge,
you. You know,
huge,
I think the thing I read was you'd cited the Beatles and Copland as being two of the biggest. You know,
yeah. In terms of inspiration, I mean, I've just on Robot Plane, the song Robot Plane Flies Over Arkansas. There's a string quartet that I put together that's very Copland-esque. I just sat down at the piano and made up, I took Arkansas Traveler and reharmonized it a lot. And I listened back to it and it sounds very Copland-esque. Just, a very major, and not that my songs reflect his music, but he's very, I feel a very strong connection. In fact, I just was commissioned to write a 5-minute chamber piece, which I just finished recently, which became 6 minutes, and it's oboe, clarinet, violin, viola, cello, and the soprano, because I've been putting music to Emily Dickinson poems, and so I took an Emily Dickinson poem and did that. So, and there are some elements of Copland in there that I can hear. So, yeah, he gets in there for sure.
It's wonderful, and it's that's one of the glorious things about listening to like Breakfast Special, but also listening through some of these 70s records is just the range of stuff that does creep in there because of the people who are making the music and the stuff they're listening to. And the same with Tony and the jazz he's listening to, or, some of the Latin sounds that come into Grisman's music. And
right.
It's the joy of the music that it keeps drawing things in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, I've really enjoyed listening to some of this music again, listening back to some of it, but also listening to some of it for the first time and just really diving into that period. And it's been a real joy to get to chat to you about it. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks, Matt. I really appreciate it. And I look forward to seeing the book when it's all done. Now you got to write the thing.
I do. This is the problem now, isn't it?
Yeah.
Lots of fun conversations to have in the process, though.
Right. Yeah. That detail of writing the book. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
thank you so much.
Thank you, Matt. I really appreciate it. Great talking to you.
Bluegrass Jamalong is proud to be sponsored by Collins Guitars and Mandolins, each and every one built from the sound up in Austin, Texas.